was published by Human Error Publishing in 2022. Perry has emceed the monthly open mic at Book Lovers Gourmet in Webster, Mass. Since May 2017, he has had several poems published in Worcester Magazine, as well as Florence Poetry Society's Silkworm, 16, Poetica Magazine, Mismore Anthology, Nature Culture's Honoring Nature Collection, National Beat Poetry Foundation, remembering Jack Kerouac on his 100th birthday, Beat Style Love Poems, and Natural World Anthologies. Meet for Tea, the Valley Review, his poem Primal was a finalist in the 2023 Beals Prize for Poetry. That's right up the road here. And his poem Herd Street, Hadwin Park in Winter was a winner in the 2024 Poems In and Out of Places, sponsored by the Mapping Worcester in Poetry and the Worcester County Poetry Association. His short story, In the Company of Trees, was published by Word Peace Journal. As a metaphysical poet, he finds inspiration in nature and endeavors to draw connections between our higher selves and the natural world. Please welcome Bob Perry.
Yay!
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here in Ashburnham. I'm going to start by reading upright. So I'm going to do something different. I haven't read from this. I published it in 2007. Wrote it most of 2006, so that's, 16 years ago? And I had I was 40 years old. I had a lot of publicity. I did cable access things, radio, newspaper, all that stuff. It was really, because when it's your first book, like everybody pays attention. And then when I started, at poetry events, I would have the book, and when you're at a poetry event, people really want to hear poetry. So today, you're going to hear a mixture of prose and poetry. This, the idea of life as a journey is something that's always exciting. So when I finally decided to write a book, this is my life up until age 40. The things that I learned in a fantasy form. So I'm going to read. I was going to read for 45 minutes, but
Yeah,
I'll read until
45 minutes is break.
All right, I'll read for 45 minutes, and then we'll do other stuff. How's that sound? Sound good? All right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Where the Journey Takes You. Prologue. Once there was a man who had a dream of what life was meant to be like. It was a lovely dream, full of the magic and color of heaven. All the things which appeared to him in this dream were exactly as they should be. Without judgment or bias, he walked through his vision and was profoundly affected by all he took in. As he walked through the ethereal garden of his fantasy, he discovered that although he was aware that he was dreaming, there was a certain sense of belonging which attached itself to him. He heard no words. All was conveyed through impressions, which brushed upon him like warm gusts of air. Although he walked unaccompanied down the winding paths toward the distant shoreline, he did not feel alone. There was a tremendous sense of peace and communion with his surroundings. He felt as though he had been there all his life and would continue his journey unencumbered by any anxieties or fears about his existence. Upon awakening, he sprung out of bed in search of a pen and paper to write everything down. As it happens, which you will know if this has ever happened to you, by the time he found the things he was looking for, he had forgotten the details of the dream. He was, however, left with a strong sense of longing and an unshakable belief in something greater than himself. Chapter 1, The Calling. Jeremiah woke up with a start. He had fallen asleep with his head pressed against the cold glass of the Greyhound bus window. He thought the tires must have hit a rut in the road, and he was now sitting bolt upright trying to gather his wits. The little girl in the seat across the aisle was watching him with interest. She was seated next to a middle-aged woman who was fast asleep with a pillow between her head and the window. "Did you know you talk in your sleep?" Jeremiah rubbed his eyes and turned to her. "I do? Really?" She smiled with all the innocence of an 8-year-old. "Yes, you do." He looked at his watch. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. "You should be sleeping like your mom over there. I'm fairly certain it must be past your bedtime." The little girl laughed. What makes you think that is my mom? Now Jeremiah was fully awake. Isn't that your mom? I just, assumed a little girl sitting next to a middle-aged woman traveling together on a Greyhound bus in the middle of the night. I used my powers of deductive reasoning. He thought he would have a little bit of fun teasing the girl. He waited for her to ask what deductive meant. What makes you think I'm a little girl? My size? She looked at him with eyes that were filled with mirth. You presume to know much, but for all your powers of deductive reasoning, you clearly haven't the faintest idea what's going on. The air felt different. He could feel the hairs on his arm tingling as they stood on end. I'm sorry, what did you say? She looked at it again and laughed. A little girl laughed, but with something behind her eyes like a treasured secret. Don't you want to know what it was you were saying in your sleep? Or would you prefer some clever wordplay? She began to sing. How would you address a somnambulist? Would you lead him awake with a fairy's kiss? Would you dance in the dark for his dreams to see? Would he know who I am when he looked at me? When she was done singing, she looked at him expectantly. Jeremiah found it difficult to focus on his surroundings. Everything around the girl was getting darker, and she stood out as if she were made of light. I don't understand. Don't you remember? The field of clovers. Haven't you seen me before? There was a part of him that awakened at the sound of her voice. What is your name? He whispered. Cassandra. At the sound of her name, he felt himself sinking backwards into the seat, melting into a warm embrace as he slowly began to awaken to his surroundings. The bus was still rumbling on through the night. The woman slept on in the seat across the aisle from him, and there was no sign of the little girl anywhere. Can you guys hear me okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Chapter 2, The Awakening. He looked at his watch. 3:33 a.m. The scenery was still factories and refineries. The smoke which bellowed out of them seemed eerie in the artificial light of the city, like sleeping dragons letting their foul breath curl lazily around the buildings. Jeremiah sighed and took out his journal. He flipped on the overhead light and began writing. Cassandra appeared in my dreams again. For some reason, I never recognize her until she says her name. It has been 3 months now since the first dream. I still don't know who she is, but in this dream, she gave me a riddle rather than just leading me through places which seemed hauntingly familiar. The only thing I remember is somnambulist and fairy's kiss. I wonder how those words are related. Well, if she's a fairy, then that explains everything about the dreams, but nothing about my journey. I wish I could believe in the land of fairy. My heart longs for something more than what I can see around me. The move from pragmatist to romantic is a bit more involved than that, though. Jeremiah stopped writing and turned again to look out the window. The bus had finally moved through the cities and was now passing the maze of cornfields in search of their next destination. He breathed a little easier and began to relax as the bucolic setting and the motion of the bus rocked him back to sleep. Have you figured it out yet? Jeremiah was walking in a field of clovers. Their bright green spread out in all directions as far as the eye could see. He looked over to see Cassandra walking next to him with that same radiant expression she always wore on her face. Why is it I remember your name as Cassandra now? I never recognized you before until you spoke my name. She smiled. It was not time. I did not wish for you to know me. You are getting closer to your destination. Your heart is reaching out towards me. She stopped abruptly and shot him a mischievous glance. Have you thought about the riddle? Here in the confines of his sleep, he found it easy to recall the riddle. Are you a fairy? A sprite? An elf? He had felt a little foolish writing it in his journal, but here it felt a perfectly natural question to ask. I am all that and more, she answered. You knew me once, but you're not yet ready to remember. Don't be afraid. You're never alone on your journey. They were coming to the end of the field of clovers. There was a small cottage at the end of the wood. Smoke drifted out the top of the chimney, and there were sounds of hammering coming from the interior. Jeremiah turned to her, and she handed him a staff. No one should go on a journey without a walking stick. Keep it close by you at all times. It will help you in many ways as you travel along. He took the staff from her and studied it. It was dark as ebony with bone-white hand grip at the top. All along the base were strange carvings which he could not decipher. Cassandra, do the markings have meaning? Indeed they do. You'll find that the meaning will become clearer with the passage of time. You will also have need of this. She handed him a small flute, also carved with strange runes. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Cassandra, but I don't know how to play. Jeremiah cast a regretful look toward the ground. This is a special instrument. It already knows the music of the spirit. Carry it close to your heart and play it when you feel the need to express something words will not convey. She held his hand for a moment, and they gestured to the door. Your journey begins here at the carpenter's hut. I must leave you now, but we will meet again soon. Don't forget to ask questions. It's how we learn. She stopped and gave him a knowing glance. And how we become healed. With those words, she vanished in an array of colors, and Jeremiah found himself knocking on the door of the cottage. Come in, come in. No need to stand outside knocking, came a kindly voice from the other side of the door. Just remember to wipe your feet on the mat. He looked down at the coarse mat under his feet. As he wiped his shoes, they began to break apart and dissolve into the fiber. He felt puzzled by the sense of release that accompanied the disintegration of his shoes, and as he opened the door, he was greeted by an old man with a firm handshake. Welcome, young man, welcome, he beamed. Come inside and have a seat by the fire. I dare say Cassandra has led you to my door, He took Jeremiah gently by the arm and led him to a burnished chair by the fireside. This is the guest chair. Please rest by the fire while I tend to the hospitality. Thank you, kind sir, Jeremiah replied. I feel I am indebted to you. Is there something I can help you with? He felt as he had entered an oasis in his weary life. Just walking through the door of the cottage had been a balm on this difficult journey. No, son, there will be time enough for you to help me later on. Just put your feet up on the footstool and relax by the fire. You'll find it easier to rest now that your shoes have been removed. He smiled in response to Jeremiah's questioning look, leaving him to ponder that cryptic statement. He walked into the adjoining room. Jeremiah breathed in the odor of the cottage. It smelled of wood shavings, hot soup, and fragrant wood burning in the fireplace. There was a mantel above the fire, which appeared to be carved on one massive piece of mahogany. All along the front were gilded figures embossed upon the edge of the wood. The shadows from the fire played along the images and made them seem to come alive. There were scenes of knights rescuing maidens from the jaws of dragons, of wise men and women healing the sick, of travelers finding safe haven, and of all sorts of mystical beasts, some good, some malign. Turning his gaze from the enchanted mantle, he looked at a circular window facing the east. There was a fair amount of sun pouring in through the open window, and he knew it must be early in the day still. The sun herself had not risen higher than the trees outside the cottage. He could hear the birds whistling in the trees, and his soul was completely at peace with his surroundings. It has been a long time since I felt like this, he thought to himself. I had almost forgotten what it was like to really breathe. Yes, yes, I'm sure you're finding the atmosphere of the cottage to your liking. The old man had re-entered, carrying a tray with 2 steaming silver mugs. He handed one to Jeremiah, who gratefully took the mug from his host's weathered hands. He then turned and placed the tray on the work table in the center of the room, pulled over a stool from the fireside, and sat down with his own cup directly across from Jeremiah. Jeremiah inhaled the aroma of the warm brown liquid within the cup. It reminded him of coffee, cocoa, cinnamon, and peppermint all at the same time. His benefactor sat across from him and graced him with a smile that was like a warm embrace. As Jeremiah sipped the elixir, he felt his strength renewed and his sense heightened. Please, sir, would you tell me your name? I'm known as Bertram, young man. Have you lived here always? Or as long as I can remember? Jeremiah looked into Bertram's face. There was no trace of judgment there. Do you know of my journey? He asked quietly. I know all about your journey, Jeremiah. The winds have borne your tale along to my ears. It is you, however, that I wish to hear about. He stopped and placed his hand gently on Jeremiah's. It is you that I am concerned with. Why do you not speak your heart to me? You are safe here. Jeremiah averted his eyes and looked at the fire. It had been many years since he had trusted anyone with his heart. Many years since he had trusted anyone at all. Part of him wanted to just make friendly conversation with Bertram, just to bask in the presence of someone who really cared. He fought the desire to let himself open up. Instead, he chose to let his focus stay on the fire. Bertram continued to sit quietly, observing Jeremiah and nodding gently to himself as he sensed his guest's inner struggle. He sipped his own drink and placed it on the floor in front of the fire. He stood slowly and reached for something on top of the mantel, which looked like a globe of pure white stone. Then he sat facing the fire with the globe cradled in both hands. Jeremiah sipped his own cup and again had that feeling of heightened awareness. He looked over toward his host, who was now staring intently at the fire. The inner struggle became stronger, but his fears prevented him from speaking freely to Bertram. Jeremiah closed his eyes, and he heard a low, soft song begin to fill the cottage. In days of old, the knights came round to slay the wicked dragons down. The captives free, the maidens fair, would sing their praises everywhere. They'd feast on meat and wine and bread, and toast the awful dragon's head, then off to dream about the Grail. They'd wake the morning setting sail. The knights are gone, their legends left within our hearts, yet so bereft are we who struggle with our plight to see the world in black and white. Bertram paused in his singing, looking over to find Jeremiah had covered his face and was gently weeping into his hands. He continued to weep softly, his tears sliding down his face and soaking the top of his garment. Bertram waited until the tears subsided and began to sing again loudly and more forcefully. O heart of stone that would be flesh, surrender to love's tender call. Cast aside life's vain pretense. Spend thyself who would take all. Jeremiah looked up and was now transfixed by his host's presence. Bertram had stood up and was holding the stone globe aloft in his right hand, gesturing at the fire with the other. The flames rose higher and higher, seeming to undulate with the old man's gestures. The globe in his hand was no longer pure white, but was now marbled and appeared more black than white. O prisoner of thine own desire, cast thyself into the fire. Be ye purged by selfless flame. Be ye now made whole again. The air around Jeremiah was completely still. Every nerve in his body tingled. He looked over at Bertram, who was now standing still as a statue, gazing at the heavens. The globe had progressed from marble to completely black. All of creation seemed to hang suspended, waiting for something to happen. Jeremiah returned his attention to the fireplace. The fire itself seemed to reach out from the confines of the hearth with outstretched hands. He stood up slowly, knowing what he had to do. Forgive me, he began, and fell to his knees. The globe now began to change its shape. The old man looked down on Jeremiah and spoke gently. May it be as you have said. You are forgiven. The dark object in Bertram's hand now completed its transformation. The newly formed raven, alit from Bertram's outstretched hand, circled 3 times around Jeremiah's head, and then flew out of the circular window, crying out his mournful song for all to hear. Bertram held out his hand to help Jeremiah up. He then handed him the staff that Cassandra had first given him outside the cottage. Bertram gave him a wise but sad smile and said, "You know what you need to do now, son. Godspeed." Somehow Jeremiah knew exactly what he needed to do. He hesitated only a moment and then abandoned all restraint and plunged headlong into the fire. Chapter 3. Trial by fire. Cassandra was waiting for him when he emerged from the fireplace. The Greyhound was now rumbling down a lonely stretch of highway in the desert, the yellow sand and red rocks, the only scenery for miles. There was no one else on the bus. Even the driver seemed a phantasm as they sat next to each other near the back. Jeremiah turned from the window slowly, absorbed in his thoughts. He was considering his experience in the fire and trying to put together the questions that he wanted to ask Cassandra. When he turned to face her, he was startled to find that she had aged a good 10 years and was now a beautiful young woman. She returned a smile for his bewildered stare. "You see me differently now because you yourself have changed. I am always the same. Those who see me will discover that I appear different to them as they progress in their own journeys. Is there something you wanted to ask me?"
Jeremiah felt his anxieties disappear as he looked into her deep blue eyes. They had lost some of their mischievous quality and was replaced by a deep tranquility. Unsure of where to begin or how to ask, his thoughts turned to the flute inside his pocket. He took it out and looked at the strange lettering carved into the side. Most of the runes were still indecipherable, but he now understood the first word. Forgiveness, he read aloud, and then put the flute to his lips and played. The song that flowed from the instrument began as a slow, melancholy tune, almost a funeral dirge. It seemed to originate from the deepest place of his being, plaintive and tinged with remorse. Cassandra sat expectantly as the music seemed to envelop the two of them in a shroud of sorrow. Just when Jeremiah thought that his heart would break from the anguish, the melody began to change. It segued from the dour minor keys to a more hopeful strain, and he began to feel the weight of his burden lifting. He continued playing, all the while watching Cassandra as her expression became more and more animated. Jeremiah closed his eyes, and the music brought to mind his experience in the fire. After diving into the fireplace, all thoughts were driven from his head except one: surrender. The raven had whispered that word in his ear as it circled about his head, and he knew that the only path toward healing was through the fire. Once inside the fireplace, he discovered his clothes had burned away, but he was not the least bit singed. When he looked down at his body, he noticed it was covered with golden scales, which formed a type of gilded armor over his skin. He walked through the flames unharmed, seeking to find his way. Off in the distance, he could make out something moving through the fire. As it drew closer, it seemed as if the inferno itself was coming alive, the flames twisting and writhing along the ground in a serpentine fashion. All at once, the conflagration shot towards the sky, and a great dragon appeared before him, born of the fire itself. Jeremiah stood frozen to the spot, gaping at the sudden appearance of the monster. Before he could react, the dragon opened wide its mouth and breathed out a foul-smelling mixture of gas and flame. As soon as the flames reached Jeremiah, they sent him into a frenzy. The only thought his mind would grab onto was the destruction of this vile beast. He used the only weapon at his disposal and rushed at the dragon with his staff. He stabbed at it, beat on it, clubbed it, and tried to gouge its eyes out, but the dragon only continued to circle around him, breathing its toxic fumes and growing larger. He found that although the dragon's breath did not seem to damage him, every time it struck him, he would go into another rage. Jeremiah stopped to survey the situation. The dragon was so large now it had to actually circle around itself to come back for an attack. Jeremiah fell down on his knees in the flames, and the anger slowly flowed out of him. The memory of his time in the cottage returned. Bertram's kindness and the raven's admonition came into clear focus in his mind's eye. He looked up and saw the dragon returning. Jeremiah stood up and faced his attacker. "You have no power over me that I have not given to you. I will no longer fight." The creature once again spewed forth its vile breath, and Jeremiah felt the rage flowing through his veins, but kept hold of the one word in his mind and allowed it to pass through him. The dragon continued for a time, but when it discovered that its victim would not retaliate, it let out a roar of absolute fury and devoured Jeremiah on the spot. Do you understand the meaning of the vision and center venture? Jeremiah had stopped playing the flute and came out of his reverie. The greyhound was still rolling along through the desert. The shroud of sorrow that had covered them while he had been playing had lifted, and the air seemed still and expectant. "That is quite a flute," Jeremiah praised. "Were you able to see the entire vision?" He had a feeling she knew all about his experience, even before he had started to play. "I was there with you, Jeremiah." Jeremiah pondered her statement. It always seemed that she spoke in layered meanings. "Do you mean you were there with me just now when I played the flute? Or were you there with me when I was in the fire? Is there a difference? When you fell to your knees before the dragon, what is it that you thought of?" "The cottage, the raven, kindness," he trailed off, waiting for her response. "And while you were rushing at the beast, what filled your heart and mind?" Jeremiah felt the rage rush back into his body and fought for control. Jeremiah, she spoke softly, you've done well on this part of the journey. You've listened to your heart and surrendered your own will the best you're able. As you now realize, the only way to destroy the dragon was to face it and allow it to pass through you. Learning to trust the wisdom of other people is always a painful reawakening. She took his hand in hers and gestured toward the back of the bus. Come, there's someone I want you to meet. They stood up together and walked a short distance to the back of the bus, stopping in front of the bathroom door. Jeremiah looked at her and could not suppress a laugh. The bathroom? Who are we going to meet in the bathroom? Cassandra smiled at his good humor. I would have thought by now you had learned not to judge by appearances. Why don't you open the door and see for yourself? Jeremiah touched the handle. It felt warm to the touch, surprisingly soft and subtle. He turned to speak to Cassandra and found that she had vanished again. He returned his attention to the door in front of him and found that the doorknob had become the hand of a young woman. They were standing on the edge of a precipice, surrounded on all sides by the great sprawling desert, the greyhound no longer in sight. Anybody need a break? You guys good? Keep going? All right.
Yes, good, it's
Chapter
great.
4, Chapter 4, The Joyful Hero. Sorry. The Joyful Healer. My name is Gwendolyn, Jeremiah. Pleased to meet you. Jeremiah was momentarily taken aback by the change in his surroundings. The landscape was stark but beautiful in its own desolate way. There were distant mesas and buttes colored with variegated reds, browns, and grays. The sky was a medley of colors. The setting sun had painted the stretched out clouds into a blazing array of crimson, deep blue, light pinks, and gold. Off in the distance you could make out a solitary blackbird heading directly into the sunset. Gwendolyn observed the direction of his gaze. He bears your burden to the west, Jeremiah. Her voice snapped him out of his contemplation. Is that the raven I met in Bertram's cottage? How far has he traveled? How far is he to go? I felt so much lighter since entering Bertram's cottage. Do you know Bertram? Oh, I'm sorry, I missed your name. Jeremiah stopped short, realizing he had been rambling on to somebody he had only just met. Gwendolyn laughed, and her laughter was like the sound of rain falling on dry land. I have known the old healer for many years. I am a frequent guest in his cottage. I have mixed some of his most potent remedies myself. Here she smiled and took Jeremiah's hand in hers. The raven will bear that portion of your burden to the land over the sea. What he has taken is that which has prevented you from moving forward in your journey. Jeremiah looked at her earnestly. Why would he do that for me? I offered him nothing in return. I have nothing to give. You may yet surprise yourself, Jeremiah. You have great potential, and that in itself is a tremendous gift. All life is sacred, and we have been imbued with two great gifts, the capacity to love and the freedom to choose. Jeremiah felt his heart stir within him. He could not doubt the sincerity of the woman who stood before him. She seemed to glow with confidence and unmitigated joy. He felt he could follow her anywhere, and she would be a perfect companion on his journey, that she would certainly lead him straight to his destination without any missteps along the way. Gwendolyn, are you to guide me for the remainder of my journey? She looked upon him with a gaze that was both kind and sympathetic. I am honored that you hold such confidence in me, Jeremiah, but you will have many guides throughout your journey. There is not one of us alone that can lead you to your destination. Jeremiah's shoulders sagged as he looked out again at the barren landscape. The raven was now a tiny dot in the distance. Jeremiah wondered how far it was to the land over the sea where his burden was bound. The sun was nearly even with the horizon, and the evening shadows had begun to creep onto the landscape. Gwendolyn turned and stood facing the wall of stone behind them and began to sing, The way is long, the path grows steep, where darkness gathers in the deep. Yet we are children born to light. We fear no shadows of the night. Though many hours before we sleep, with constant vigilance we keep the narrow path which leads the way, through shadows hard to greet the day. The time has come, make swift our feet. Now part the rock, and in we leap. The escarpment which they stood on began to tremble and shake as the wall of stone ripped apart from the center, revealing a well-lit passageway into the heart of the mountain. Jeremiah looked incredulously from Gwendolyn to the opening, and then back again to Gwendolyn. She laughed. I'm stronger than I look, my friend. Jeremiah smiled in return. Apparently so. He walked over to the entrance and peered down through the long, steep entryway. Are we taking this path through the mountain? I hope it is this well lit throughout. Now that evening's here, there won't be any light at all, not even coming from the fissures and rifts on the mountainside. The mountain has its own light within, although there are many dark and twisted passageways that one could get lost if he failed to be attentive to his journey. Shall we enter? She led the way down the newly formed passage toward the heart of the mountain. Jeremiah followed, using his staff to help walk along the roughly hewn steps, which seemed to wind down forever into the very bowels of the earth. He marveled at the fact that Gwendolyn seemed to glide effortlessly down the trail before him. Gwendolyn, why is it that we need to go through the mountain? If I'm bound for the land over the sea, wouldn't it make more sense to take the direct route through the desert? You are not ready to face the night in the wasteland, Jeremiah, even with me as your guide. You must travel the path that is set before you. Each new experience builds on the one before. You cannot learn to build a house before you understand the working of each tool. Presently, she stopped at a small landing at the base of a rocky staircase that they had been descending. Before them was a short rope bridge which spanned a deep chasm in the rock. There was no light whatsoever emanating out of the chasm, which accentuated the darkness even more. Gwendolyn, where does the light come from? I don't see any source of illumination, natural or otherwise. The light emanates from the goodwill of the mountain itself, although you will find that some of the creatures here prefer the darkness and so influence their surroundings accordingly. Here she picked up a pebble from the ground and tossed it into the dark fissure before them. Jeremiah could hear the echo of the stone as it bounced off the walls on the way down, eventually making a distant plop as it landed in a pool of liquid far below. Gwendolyn made a silencing gesture and pointed to the chasm. They stood side by side as a sound began to emerge from the depths beneath them. It began as a low hissing sound and slowly began to get louder and more pronounced. Whatever the creatures were, there were many of them, and they appeared to be very agitated. The sound they produced made the hair on Jeremiah's arms stand on end. What? Jeremiah began, but again, Gwendolyn put her finger to her lips and urged him to remain silent. The hissing sounds turned to barely audible voices. Gwendolyn touched Jeremiah's ears, and the whispers became even more pronounced. He is here. Has he come to join us? We must tempt him. The chorus of whispery voices swelled in assent. Does he know that we are here? He will not recognize us when he sees us. We will use our cunning to beguile him. Who shall we send? There was a great deal of hissing and whispering, none of which was intelligible to Jeremiah. All at once the voices fell silent. Then it is decided. I will go and prepare at once. The voice hisses their agreement and fell silent again. Jeremiah looked up from the darkness and into the radiance of Gwendolyn's face. How do they know about me? What are they? How do I guard against them? His heart began to beat very fast, and he had not felt so much fear since his journey began. Gwendolyn took him by the arm and led him over to sit upon a small stone bench which protruded from the wall. She then produced a small cordial from within the folds of her robes. She uncorked the bottle and gave it to Jeremiah to drink. The aroma of the liquid within reminded him of his grandmother's kitchen on Thanksgiving Day. And as he closed his eyes and drank it, he was momentarily transported back to those light-hearted days of his early childhood. Eventually, Jeremiah's body began to relax, and Gwendolyn took the empty bottle from his lax hand and replaced it with her vestments. Jeremiah, you must be on your guard against deception. There are those who would lead you astray with shallow praise and hollow promises. Be true to your heart's leading, and you will do well. I must leave you for a short time, but we will be reunited shortly. I promise you this, when you see me again, you will know me better and esteem me more dearly than you do now. Do not fear the unknown. Trust your heart and remember to be grateful for all you have. He opened his eyes and looked toward where her voice had been moments before and found that he was alone once again. You still good? Anybody need a cookie or something? Chapter 5, Whispery Voices. Jeremiah continued to sit on the bench for a time. trying to piece together Gwendolyn's warning and attempting to figure out who the voices were and how best to prepare for what they had in store for him. Eventually, he decided the best course of action would be to move ahead and trust his intuition. The fear that had recently gripped him had vanished, leaving in its place a calm assurance. He stood up and walked over to the chasm. There was no sound from below, and nothing to see except the strange darkness emanating from within, which seemed to swallow the light from all around the hole. Jeremiah walked over to the rope bridge. It was about 15 feet long and appeared very secure. Once he began to cross the gap, he found the lighting changed the closer he came to the other side. Where on the way into the mountain, everything seemed brightly illuminated. The deeper into the mountain he walked, the dimmer the light appeared and the more pronounced the shadows became. He stepped off the bridge and onto the other side. He found the rocks beneath his feet to be slippery and used his staff to brace himself up against the rock wall. When he looked back toward the direction he had come, nothing at all was visible. The rope bridge seemed to vanish the moment he stepped off, leaving him no choice but to forge ahead. There was enough light to walk by, but it was dim and provided only enough visibility to illumine the area around his footsteps. The going was slow, and slick rocks and unsure footing made Jeremiah very conscious of every step. To his left was a sheer rock wall, which he used to brace himself when he became tired. He could not lean long against it, for it was covered with ice. The chill went right through to his very heart. To the right of the path was a long fissure, perhaps part of that same chasm which he had crossed earlier. Whatever the case, he found that if he veered too close to the edge, the darkness seemed to overshadow him and sap his strength. After a time of struggling along this difficult passageway, he began to wonder why Gwendolyn had left him, and if there was any point at all to following this path. He found a large rock to sit down on, which was curiously shaped like a giant throne. As he sat down and ruminated about his plight, he heard a sad, sweet song fill the air around him. Oh, the suffering you have borne, unjust rejection, neglect and scorn, the weight of the world that you have borne upon your weary shoulders. How you've earned a little rest, tired and tried, oft hard-pressed. No one knows just how depressed you feel as you get older. Come with me and take your ease. Drink my tonic, you who grieve. I am someone who believes in the victim they have made you. Lay your head now in my arms. I will keep you safe and warm and shelter you from things that harm. And I will make you the envy of all that hate you. Jeremiah had been listening to the song fill the cavern. His former courage and confidence now replaced with a melancholy indifference to his surroundings, even in regards to his journey altogether. He sat lost in past memories of those who had wounded him, reliving the pain and giving in to thoughts of persecution and fantasies of retaliation. The longer he sat, the more comfortable the rock became, and the more it seemed to mold to the contour of his body. After a while, the anger seemed to melt out of him, leaving only the sadness and thoughts of futility. It was almost as if the rock which now surrounded him absorbed his anger and used it to fuel the molding process. Are you comfortable, Jeremiah? Jeremiah snapped out of his trance and stared wide-eyed at the woman before him. She was tall, thin, and austere. She had bright green eyes, a small pointed nose, tight-set lips, and long black hair which was braided tightly together and hung down the length of the green silk kimono she wore. There was a cold beauty about her, and Jeremiah felt strangely comfortable in her presence, almost despite himself. Do I know you, madam? He inquired. Not nearly as well as you should, she countered. It comes from all this nonsense of running through fires and wandering around in caves. What on earth are you doing down here in this godforsaken mountain anyway? Jeremiah thought about her question for a moment. This is the path that Gwendolyn led me to. She told me that this was the way my journey must take me, right before she abandoned you to the treacherous pathways in this cold, dark mountain. Some guide she turned out to be. She spoke in a calm, even voice, which dripped with false sincerity. She left you all alone to fend for yourself. My poor Jeremiah, I would never leave you alone like that. She's just like all the others who have mistreated and abandoned you. Jeremiah tried hard to recall the way he felt when he was in Gwendolyn's presence, and he could never remember having felt so alive before. How could that have been an illusion? He simply could not have been so mistaken about her. On the other hand, why did she say that she had to leave him? He could not clearly recall the reason, and in his torpid state, he had forgotten all about the whispery voices and Gwendolyn's impassioned warning. The woman in front of him seemed to sense his inner turmoil and pressed her point further. Yes, Jeremiah, she seems so kind and thoughtful, but the truth is in our actions, isn't it? She led you down a dark and difficult path, and then let you slip and slide and freeze your way until I came to rescue you. Where would you be if not for me? You probably would have sat there in that chair and froze to death. Take this. She produced a vial of bright green liquid, which was the exact color of her eyes. This will restore you to your former self, and we can leave this accursed mountain together. There was an eagerness and hunger in her eyes which made Jeremiah stir uneasily in his seat. It was at this point he realized that the stone on which he had been resting now held him fast. What's going on? How did you trap me in this chair? You don't seem to understand, Jeremiah. I had nothing to do with your entrapment. You got yourself stuck in that chair. All that self-righteous anger oozed out of your pores and became the glue which holds you fixed in that spot. Why, if I hadn't come along when I did, who are you? Jeremiah spat out. How do I know you're on my side? What's in that green vial? How did I end up in this place anyway? Jeremiah felt his anger returning and eyed the staff which he had unfortunately left leaning against the cavern wall when he sat down. The woman held him in her steady gaze and continued speaking in the same mawkish tones. Now calm down, Jeremiah. I've already told you that I came here to rescue you. I'm not like those others. I do not expect anything of you. I know what a hard life you have had, how everyone has let you down and left you wounded. I will never abandon you. I am your one true friend. Just drink up this elixir, your bonds will be loosened, and we can go back to the way things were before you started this foolish journey. Something awoke in Jeremiah at the mention of his journey. You would have me give up everything I've worked for in exchange for what? Your maudlin sympathy? Who are you, anyway? What is it that you're after? The woman gave him a pitying look. What is it that you are after, Jeremiah? Did you really think that you could change who you are? Did you really suppose those guides of yours cared for your well-being? Why do you think they'll keep disappearing? Isn't it obvious? They're just playing a game with you, having a bit of fun at your expense. You can't possibly believe they care at all what happens to you. They think they're being charitable by giving you presents and false hope, but they don't know you like I do, my poor, misunderstood Jeremiah. Jeremiah finally reached the point where he could not tolerate this woman's coddling anymore. He sat up as straight as he could in his chair, looked her directly in the eyes, and shouted, I don't want your pity! For the first time since she appeared, the woman lost her composure. She trembled slightly, and her voice lost some of its insipid quality as she continued. My dear Jeremiah, I will have you remember that it's your foolishness that has brought you to this reprehensible state. I would never have suggested you go wandering around in the countryside, consorting with fairy creatures, or accepting strange brews mixed by curious old men, or wrestling with fiery dragons, or wandering around hopelessly lost in dark and dangerous caverns. Now look at you, hopelessly trapped in a stone throne of your own making. Let's be sensible now. Drink this draught, and we can go back to the life you and I shared so amiably. My goodness, there wasn't even a need to get off the bus. The mention of the bus returned his thoughts to Cassandra and to the flute in his breast pocket. He had no way to reach either with the gift she had bestowed upon him, but his thoughts began to clear as he looked beyond the woman standing in front of him and focused instead on the staff he had left leaning against the wall. There emblazoned there emblazoned against the black staff, some of the runes had changed and become legible. In bone-white letters toward the top of the staff, Jeremiah read aloud, "Gratitude." The woman gasped and staggered back into the wall. Her eyes grew big as saucers, and she breathed out, "What did you say?" Jeremiah regarded her reaction to this new word. He considered the implications and then continued, "Why, I was just thinking about how grateful I was that I have had such wonderful guides along my journey. I would never have guessed that some of the things which hurt the most would teach me the most valuable lessons." The woman looked on in absolute horror. Her whole appearance began to shift and become less defined. Jeremiah felt a song of thankfulness rising up from within him, and he closed his eyes and opened his mouth to let it forth. "Through dark of night and the good will shine, and lead me towards the choicest vines, the decision mine, my will to yield to the higher ground or the potter's field. I will rejoice though all seems lost. I will give my all and not count the cost, for no sacrifice can be called too grand, now to choose the good and to make a stand. O selfishness, my soul's foul bane, depart from me, ne'er be seen again." Jeremiah finished his song and opened his eyes. There on the floor of the cavern, where the woman had previously stood, was a puddle of green slime, oozing its way toward a crack in the cavern floor. It made strange, whispery sounds as it slid into the crevice and out of sight. Like that one? How we doing for time?
Doing okay? I think we got one more chapter. Was that a yes?
Go for it.
Gotta find out what happens.
All right, wow. Well,
Might look for that.
Yeah.
no, unfortunately, it's 2 hours to read the whole book.
Oh.
Sorry. We'll talk about that. Chapter 6, The Cave. Jeremiah breathed a sigh of relief at the departure of his unwelcome guest. He closed his eyes again and let the tension wash out of his body. His breathing slowed down, and he felt a calmness come over him. He let the time slip away, certain that he would hear Gwendolyn's or Cassandra's voice at any minute. His emotions began to shift from feeling grateful for the help that he had received toward feeling pleased at his own cleverness in dispensing the unpleasant. He began to fancy that he had managed to rid himself of her entirely on his own strength. He felt a powerful surge in his breast and attempted to propel himself off the stone seat to resume his journey, only to find that he was still stuck fast to the rock. Jeremiah was astonished. He had been certain that in driving the woman away, his bonds would be loosed and he would be free to continue on his way. He also found himself angry over the fact that neither of his guides had bothered to show up and explain his current situation or to lead him out of this mountain. In his indignation, he completely forgot the word that had delivered him from the grip of the green-eyed woman. He also forgot that it was precisely that self-righteous anger which had bound him to the stone in the first place. He began to shout for Cassandra and Gwendolyn. When they did not appear, he began to curse their apparent lack of concern for his welfare. The more he shouted, the darker the air around him became. He stopped shouting and began to quietly smolder, his anger seeping out of him and into the stone chair. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he hardly noticed he was sinking until it was too late. Jeremiah fell through the stone chair and landed in a slimy mud pit in a subterranean cavern. The sudden shock of the fall brought him back to his senses. He looked around and spied a dim light shimmering far off in the distance. The earlier luminescence that had helped him pick his way along the path was not to be found in this part of the mountain. He began slipping his way along, groping toward the distant flickering light. His thoughts became gloomy and his mood continued to darken the farther he slogged his way through the strange, viscous substance of the pit. It seemed to cling to him, forming a tight layer over his clothes and skin. To make matters worse, he did not have his staff to help pull him along. In his wretched state, he could not help allowing his anger to vent out of his mouth as he began to rant about everything that came to mind, beginning with his current situation and moving backward over his life. In a short time, he had covered his entire adulthood, bewailing the injuries he had sustained, both real and fancy. He was just beginning to move into the events of his adolescence when he came to the end of the pit. What next? Jeremiah thought aloud as he dragged himself out and lay panting on the stone floor of the cavern. He propped himself up against the wall. He was certain now that the light had been following some type of fire by the way it shimmered and reflected off the cavern walls. He looked down upon himself and saw that the stuff of the pit had attached itself to him like glue. Great, Jeremiah groaned. It looks like I've been tarred and feathered like some sort of outcast. I wonder what other surprises lie in store for me. I don't know what I was thinking when I agreed to this journey anyways. Jeremiah felt a tingling sensation in his arms, which ran all the way down his spine in his journey. It seemed like a million years ago since he sat in his grandfather's kitchen, listening to the old man share his wisdom with his beloved grandson. Jeremiah, he said, each of us has a purpose in the world. The Creator does not create without a purpose. The world is full of beauty, and it's full of pain. Part of our journey is to learn to appreciate the beauty and to bring healing to those who suffer, to soothe their pain. Like when you put a Band-Aid on my skinned knee, Grandpa? Yes, just like that. Only there are many people in the world who suffer much deeper than that. There is only one thing that makes people better when they hurt inside. Do they have to swallow the Band-Aid to help their insides? The old man laughed gently at Jeremiah's innocence. No, my boy, they need something that only we can give them. Something that does not come out of a box, but that comes from our hearts. What is it, Grandpa? Love and acceptance. Two great healers. Jeremiah looked puzzled, and his grandfather smiled and tousled his hair. Someday you will understand. When you start your own journey, it will all begin to make sense. Don't be in too much of a hurry to grow up, okay? Jeremiah came out of his reflection and spoke aloud to himself. Well, I certainly did take my time growing up, huh, Grandpa? He sighed. I'm sorry I let you down. I haven't been real big on love and acceptance. The turmoil within him continued to rage as he struggled to his feet. He knew that he should let go of the past which continued to haunt him and cause him misery and pain. At the same time, he could not let go of the anger and bitterness towards those who had caused him so much suffering. He continued walking to the end of the corridor, feeling very self-conscious about his appearance. As he turned the corner, the narrow pathway opened into a large underground room. There in the middle of the stone floor was a large frog-faced person, horrible to look at, strangely fascinating. He was sitting cross-legged on the floor, holding a stick and roasting some kind of meat over a small fire. The walls of the cavern were hewn out into rough shelves, and on each of these shelves were large glass jars filled with noxious-looking blobs of what appeared to be meat, just like this creature was cooking now. Jeremiah walked over to the fire and stood directly across from the creature. The frogman looked up from his cooking and gave him a wide-mouthed grin. How nice of you to dress up for dinner, he croaked out in a strange, throaty voice. He laughed at the way Jeremiah winced and then continued, Where have you come from, boy? I am on a journey, sir. Right now I'm seeking the way out of this mountain. Can you help me? Jeremiah had learned by this time not to judge by appearances and hoped that this repulsive creature might, in fact, assist him in his quest. The frogman studied him closely for a few minutes before he spoke. Maybe, he drawled, then let his tongue flick out of his mouth and snatched the meat from the end of the stick. As he began to chew, his skin became more frog-like, and his eyes rolled back as he murmured, Ah, sweet retribution. I beg your pardon? Jeremiah began to inquire. Just remembering old times, young friend. The frogman put down his stick and stood up facing Jeremiah. Can I offer you something to eat? Jeremiah watched him walk over to the rows of jars. He fought hard to hide the revulsion he had experienced at watching the strange being eat his horrible dinner and shuddered at the thought of partaking in the same manner. Do you know what really makes my blood boil? He called over his shoulder as he walked to the jars farthest away from the fire. Not wishing to appear rude, Jeremiah opted to respond to the question rather than assume it's just rhetorical. What is that, sir? Self-righteousness. Would some people think that they are better than other people? I mean, really? Here he paused and took down and examined a really nasty-looking jar. You would think that by talking with some people, that they actually believe themselves to be perfectly in the right all the time, that every choice they made was the right choice, and that when others choose a different path, there must be an error. I wonder if they're born with that arrogance or if it's inherited. What say you, boy? Now Jeremiah had been observing the creature since it had eaten its meal and noticed some subtle changes in its appearance since he first came into the room. For one thing, it looked less human, more amphibian. Uncertain of how to answer, he decided to respond to this question with one of his own. Well, sir, I have always had a difficult time with confronting hypocrisy in other people. It has been suggested to me in the past that perhaps the thing which angers us the most about other people is the very thing we detest within ourselves. Do you think this might be true? The frogman chuckled and approached Jeremiah. Very clever boy. I see you've had some instruction along the way. I fear, however, that you are purposely forgetting your old experiential knowledge. Need I remind you of the torment you went through, the lies, the taunting, the humiliation, the abuse? Do you want to excuse those things as something that is undesirable within yourself? I didn't think so. What they did is inexcusable, unforgivable, and so we will continue to hate them, won't we, Jeremiah? The creature had resumed its position on the floor while it was speaking, and it had begun roasting the contents of this new jar over the fire. Jeremiah was completely stunned. He had not considered the impact that his past had impressed upon his present state of mind. The frogman was right. The anger and bitterness were there just lurking beneath the surface. All is not lost, my young friend, and things are not always as they appear. Can you deny that dark place within yourself? Does it not sometimes clamor for attention? Does it not cause us to sometimes act selfishly and curse our friends in times of doubt? Does it not cause us to fall and cover ourselves in shame? The frogman had been speaking in the same raspy voice, but his tone was surprisingly not reproachful, but rather empathetic. Jeremiah was surprised that he not only knew what had transpired right before he came into the cave, but he seemed interested in what was going on with his journey. He was still not certain if this being before him was friend or foe, so he spoke cautiously. How shall I address you, sir? By what name are you called? You are trying to determine my affiliation, boy. You want to know whether I am to assist you in your journey or to block your progress. Is that correct? Jeremiah thought it best at that point to be completely honest. Yes, that is true. Well, now, that is some refreshing honesty. You have had quite a journey so far, young man. You have made good choices and bad choices. You have moved forward and fallen back, and now you are here in this cavern trying to make the right choice again. What is your desire? What is it that you have come here seeking? Is it simply to find a way out of this mountain, or is there something more? Jeremiah thought this over for a few minutes. Again, complete disclosure seemed the best course of action. Healing, sir. I have come seeking healing. I have been wounded, and I have embarked on a journey to get better. For what purpose? The frogman asked. I'm sorry, what do you mean? I mean, the frogman continued, what is the purpose of your being healed? I don't understand, sir. That is the purpose of my journey, the reason I was called in the first place. Well, I don't think so. I believe that pain was the motivator, and that healing is what you seek to remove the pain. Once you're healed, what then? Jeremiah was taken aback. I hadn't thought about that. I thought not. No matter, the frogman returned. I appreciate your honesty. You asked my name, and I shall give you some idea of who I am. The creature then closed his eyes and sang in a voice quite unlike his hoarse-speaking voice. It was plaintive and playful at the same time. It's funny how it seems to be that you're like you and I'm like me, and that there is no in-between, or at least that's what it seems. Can we look beyond the guise and see the truth behind the lies? Perhaps in time we also see I'm quite like you, and you like me. His host had now finished his song and stood up, placing the stick in Jeremiah's hand. It is bitter going down, but it is sweet to the stomach, the frogman counseled. He put his hand upon Jeremiah's shoulder and spoke softly. The path to healing often takes unexpected turns. This one is part of your journey. Jeremiah looked up from the ground and met the frogman's steady gaze. Beneath his grotesque exterior, his eyes were clear and bright and sincere. Jeremiah had no comprehension of the purpose of eating this foul offering, and was not exactly certain of his host's motives, but held on to one thing for certain. He had chosen to follow this journey regardless of any impediments, and was acting in good faith. He closed his eyes and uttered a silent supplication for strength. His first thought when the substance entered his mouth was how absolutely correct the frogman was. The bitterness was like poison to his tongue, and he had no choice but to chew it well, because it would not go down otherwise. When he opened his eyes moments later, he found that the cave had disappeared, and he was now in a long hallway. The floor was black marble, the ceiling translucent, with a sort of unearthly light shining through which illuminated the corridor as far as he could see. Each side of the corridor was lined with doors and appeared to stretch out beyond the range of his vision. He could not, however, suppress the desire to look behind him, but found that when he did, everything appeared inverted. When he looked behind him, it was he who was the frogman, and he was sitting alone by the fire, roasting that same strange meat on a stick. It was like looking at something through the reverse end of a telescope. It appeared so small and far away. He had the most peculiar feeling watching himself by the fire. The frogman's soliloquy took on a new dimension in his thoughts as he turned once again to the passageway. Jeremiah walked to the first door and peered through the glass pane at the top part. He saw a small child being bullied by a larger child. His chest tightened at the sight. This was a familiar enough experience from his own childhood. He put his hand to the doorknob to open the door and stop the aggressor, but drew his hand back quickly when he discovered it was hot as fire. Jeremiah looked back through the window to see another scene. The bully was walking up the path to his own home. He no longer seemed intimidating. He walked slowly past the garbage strewn across the front yard. He looked up at the window with a face frozen in terror. Out of the house came an unkempt man with a can of beer in his hand, shouting something at the boy and making wild gestures. The boy looked like he wanted to turn and run, but thought better of it and walked up to the doorway. The man grabbed him by his shirt and roughly pulled him into the doorway and slammed it shut. Jeremiah stood there stunned as the light in the doorway went out. He had never thought about the reasons why a person would want to intimidate someone else. He had been so locked into his own identity as victim that it had not occurred to him that everyone has their story, and that abusers could very well have been abused themselves. As he turned from the doorway with this revelation in mind, all the other doors along the corridor began to fade from view. He started walking toward the end of the hallway and discovered how light his step had become. He felt like skipping, but as he couldn't be sure that no one was watching, men don't like to be caught skipping. It's very undignified. He ran like the wind toward the far end. He ran for what seemed like miles, the doors disappearing before him as he ran, running solely for the joy of feeling unburdened and free from care. He laughed as he ran, and the sound rang out about him like the strains of a glorious chorus, till at last he came to the end of a hallway, where he burst out into the open field and threw himself down on the ground, still laughing, panting, and wondrously out of breath. That's the halfway point of the book. Thank you very much. There's just one quick thing. I have a cast of characters in the back. Every character in here was actually chosen from something called Behind the Name. There's meaning for each of the characters. Jeremiah is from the Hebrew name, which means Yahweh is uplifted. Cassandra is from the Greek, Cassandra, which means shining upon man. Bertram means bright raven, and the raven himself in Australia, the raven is known as a bird of sorrows. It's believed that he takes the sadness from humanity and flies it away, his mournful cry telling the burden that he carries so the people may have relief. And Gwendolyn means white ring in Welsh. And the other two people you haven't met. So thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Yay.
I haven't read from this in 16 years. So,
That was fun.
I read most of the poetry. So I do not have any copies of this.
sorry about that. All the poetry you heard tonight is in my poetry books. You can find this anywhere. It's been out there for 16 years. It's everywhere. I usually refer people to Bookshop because they support indie publishers. You can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any of those places. So. All right?
So maybe, actually, any questions
Oh, yeah.
for Bob?
What got you started on
So I was turning 40. And I've been writing poetry since I was 12. I'd always loved fantasy. I was talking to Fred before, Tolkien was my first major influence. And the idea of life as a journey has always really excited me. Just thinking of life as a journey, everything that I've gone through is a part of that journey. So what I wanted to do was take everything I had learned up until that point and put it in a fantasy setting. And that's how it came up. I think it took about a year to write. And then anybody else? Or did you have a follow-up? No? I hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, so maybe let's take like 10 minutes and you can sell books and we can
Okay.
talk and then we'll start the open mic.
Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.